it got off the ground safely.
And they took off within 2 hours of each other.
Ice cannot have been the only factor in this crash.
Big 8950, winds 290 at 4 knots. Takeoff now, runway 22.
In search of other factors, they consider the last-minute runway change.
Copy that, Gander, runway 22.
Not the runway they were expecting.
But they quickly conclude that the alternate runway could not have had any bearing on this crash.
Runway 22 is the longest runway at Gander, so in fact it gave them the best margin for performance.
Investigators examine and document the crash site, trying to determine the trajectory of the plane as it went down.
This was a very heavily wooded area, and as it got closer to the ground, it started clipping the trees.
And we're going to need pictures of the treetops as well, and we're going to need aerial shots.
But what they need most of all is the information from the plane's 2 black boxes. They could hold the key to understanding what doomed Flight 1285. But as soon as they're recovered, McNair sees a potential problem.
We were disappointed to see with such an old recorder, an old foil recorder, as they really just don't give enough information to the investigators.
Well, send them off to Ottawa and we'll see what we've got.
The older design of FDR engraves data on a slow-moving roll of stainless steel foil. Though the foil is fire-resistant, it can record only 4 flight parameters, such as airspeed and altitude. The newer digital flight recorders can record hundreds of parameters. All they can do is send the black boxes to the National Research Council's Flight Recorder Playback Center and hope for the best. Then, with the investigation only hours old, it takes a dramatic turn. An overseas U.S. consulate receives word from someone claiming responsibility for the crash. The caller says it was the work of Islamic Jihad, a branch of Hezbollah.
If you had to think about any one terrorist group operating in the Middle East at this time, which had an intent as well as a capacity to target American military personnel, that was Hezbollah.
The call opens the possibility that a terrorist bomb brought down Flight 1285.
Tensions were really high in the world at that time when an aircraft fully loaded with American soldiers crashes. There's always questions that come up.
David McNair sends portions of the wreckage to an RCMP forensics lab to be tested for bomb residue. The team searches for evidence that Flight 1285 exploded before it hit the ground. They look for any fallen debris between the runway and the point of impact.
If the aircraft had exploded before it hit the trees, one would expect something would come off the aircraft and we would have found it. We didn't find anything, nothing at all. So we knew with confidence that the aircraft hit the trees, the first impact intact.
It's a similar story when the test results from the RCMP come back. They find no trace of bomb residue. And both U.S. and Canadian officials suggest Islamic Jihad's claim of responsibility could be false.
One of the things that obviously benefits terrorist organizations is to spread the claim for operational responsibility very, very broadly, so to kind of boost the reputation of their organization, again, to instill greater fear. So it's difficult to separate fact from fiction.
With terrorism looking less likely, investigators continue their focus on the performance of the aircraft.
35 feet, 6 inches. 4.5-degree declination.
The airplane had struck some trees about half a mile from the end of the runway, and we could see a distinct pattern in the trees.
Using photographs from the crash site, Investigators plot the height of 378 trees to determine the DC-8's exact position as it went down.
The airplane was right wing low with a nose high attitude relative to the trees. Through photogrammetry, we determined that in fact the aircraft was way above the stall angle of the aircraft. So the aircraft was clearly stalled in a high rate of descent.
The plane's radical nose-up position prevented it from getting the lift needed to keep it in the air. Investigators can't explain why the plane was flying at such an extreme angle. One clue about what the pilots were doing comes from a piece of cockpit wreckage, the airspeed indicator.
Look here. Here's the bug at 140.
It shows that the crew set a takeoff speed of 144 knots, and that the plane reached an airspeed of at least 165 knots.
Bugs set on the right. Copy that.
Investigators hope that a much more detailed picture of the pilot's last moments will emerge from the cockpit voice recorder. But they're in for disappointment.
Well, it doesn't sound like it recorded anything from the cockpit.
The cockpit recorder wasn't functioning properly. It didn't record any of the crew's conversations.
With the absence of cockpit voice recorder, we don't know exactly what the crew was doing or what they were facing.
Their hopes now rest with the flight data recorder.
Even this rudimentary recorder would have got some indication to show what speeds they rotated at. What warning lights, if any, were they seen? What was the reaction? All these things are extremely valuable.
But it turns out to be only marginally more useful than the cockpit voice recorder.
The recorder for the Arrow Air accident was extremely limited. We were able to determine, first of all, speed, a little bit of altitude, and heading of the aircraft. There was no indication on there of engine power, bank angle, pitch angle.
The flight data recorder tells investigators that Arrow Air 1285 began its takeoff roll and increased to a speed of 167 knots. Liftoff occurred 51 seconds from the start of the roll. 2 seconds later, the speed began to decrease.
Come on, airspeed! Airspeed!
Speed dropped off very quickly, and so we knew that the aircraft was below normal flying speed. We got that much from the recorder.
It tells us almost nothing.
But a closer look at the flight data does reveal a potentially valuable clue. The distance needed to get to takeoff speed was longer than what the pilots had planned for.
We looked at the acceleration distances, and it took a little bit longer than expected.
4,300 feet, 100 knots. 6,300 feet, 144 knots.
They should be lifting off now.
Investigators discover that liftoff occurred some 4 seconds later, or more than 1,000 feet further than it should have.
8,000 feet, 167 knots.
Extra 1,000 feet to get off the ground.
Why'd it take them so long?
81. Rotate.
They used the full power, and we would expect them to rotate a little earlier, take off a little earlier.
The longer than normal takeoff supports the original theory that ice on the wings played a role in the crash. But investigators know that can't be the whole story.
Icing itself is not necessarily the only thing that happened. Accidents don't just usually have one item, they have several items.
Determined to find out what else besides ice on the wings contributed to the crash, the CASB turns its attention to the plane's flaps. For the DC-8, the optimal flap setting for takeoff is 18 degrees.
Looks like the flaps were extended.
With detailed work, We could say with some reasonable certainty of where the flaps were, which we believe were in the normal takeoff position.
They wonder if ice, combined with malfunctioning engines, caused the plane to stall. The engines are examined at the CASB lab in Ottawa.
Each engine was recovered on site, and immediately you can tell that there was rotational damage on all the engines.
Wood debris is found deep inside all 4 of the turbines.
A lot of tree debris. It means the engine was running when it hit the trees.
Evidence shows the DC-8 was properly configured for takeoff and that there was nothing wrong with the engines. So why was Flight 1285 slow to get off the ground? Investigators focus in on the weight of the aircraft.
It's 101,000 pounds for fuel, passengers, and cargo unchanged.
They had predicted that each passenger and baggage would weigh 170 pounds.
That average weight, 170 pounds, matches the estimated weight for male passengers set out in the Aero Air guidelines.
As a pilot, having flown many military people around, this didn't seem to ring true, so we immediately looked at that aspect of the investigation.
Good morning. Have a rec form for some personnel files.
Following his hunch, McNair soon makes a crucial discovery.
Regular commercial flights has a mixture of folks. It has men, women, children, so then the average doesn't work out as much.
But this was no ordinary commercial flight. All 256 passengers were adults, almost all of them large men.
We actually looked at the medical records of the passengers in terms of getting their actual weight during their last medical.
In my own case, I normally weigh 175, but when I've got all my gear on, or I'm bringing it on board an aircraft, I'm bringing on board 200 pounds or more.
We estimated that a more realistic weight would have been 220 pounds per passenger. That includes the passenger, everything they were carrying, and the equipment they had.
With the new estimates, he calculates the weight of the passengers at more than 54,000 pounds. That's 12,000 pounds heavier than the weight recorded on the load sheet.
It's not even close.
But this plane had been flying with that weight all night, taking off from Cairo, then from Cologne without any problems. The ice picked up in Gander may have made the difference.
You can take off at a heavier than normal weight, and if there are no other factors at play, you can get away with it. If you have something else like ice, you have a serious problem.
Investigators now strongly suspect that it was a combination of ice and extra weight that prevented the DC-8 from staying in the air.
Okay, this has to be it. Ice and weight.
We had a lot of scientific basis to say that the aircraft should have flown but did not. Why didn't it fly? We had 2 powerful reasons. One was weight, the other was even probably more powerful, is a small amount of ice contamination on the aircraft.
But they can only theorize. No one in Gander saw ice on the wings. It's impossible to know how much there was. That's one problem. McNair and Bogue now must confront another. Some of their own colleagues on the CASB are raising doubts about the findings. One of those with questions is board member and aviation expert Les Philotas.
Well, as soon as I started looking at the draft report, I skimmed some of it and went to the part that was my technical specialty, the flight data recorder part, and as soon as I looked at it, I said there's something really wrong here.
CASB member Les Philotas wonders how Flight 1285 could lose thrust and crash so quickly after takeoff.
I did rough calculations, and it just showed that to get that kind of deceleration, you'd have to lose not 1, 2, or 3 engines, but all 4, and that was just a startling thing to see right away.
What's your altitude? Pull up. Come on, airspeed. Airspeed!
They said the aircraft would I believe that the exact phrase was destroyed by a fuel-fed fire.